SiriusXM Insight. This is Stand Up with Pete Dominick.
So a couple weeks ago, we heard news that China officially ended their controversial one-child rule, and it made us think, what was that all about? What was the impact of that? What was it like living under that law? In America, we're so divided, obviously, over the women's reproductive rights, abortion. In China, it's the law, forced abortion. We've got the best guest on it. She's the author of a new ebook, which I guess is supposed to be published in February, but they rushed it based on this news. It's titled OneChild, The Story of China's Most Radical Experiment. Comes out in hardcover in January, but right now it's available on ebook. Get it. She's also a fellow at New America and a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, and really happy to have Mei Fong joining us for the first time. Mei, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me, Pete.
So, a million questions about this policy, but obviously, where does it come from? Where does the idea and when does the idea of one child come from?
I know, it's pretty amazing if you think about it, right?
Oh, yeah.
One whole nation. Well, basically, China was having a big population boom in the 60s and 70s, and they were very worried that they couldn't, advance economically. China was very poor coming out of the Cultural Revolution. So they actually had a population planning policy in place in the 70s that was actually pretty successful, but it wasn't as coercive as the one-child policy. But they decided, no, we need something more drastic because we need to supercharge our economy. And so they went and decided to do this one-child policy. So the whole idea was, we need to advance economically. And it was very bizarre because actually this whole thing was created by China's rocket scientists, who and all these economists and sociologists and demographers had pretty much no say in it at all.
Is that right?
Yeah.
I mean, I did not. I somehow assumed that it was designed by demographers and economists, which would beg the question: what were they thinking based on what we see now? 30 and 50 years later, whatever. That I know you've written all about. So it wasn't someone who really understood, or a team of people who understood economics and demographics.
No, I mean the thing is, China was just coming out of the Cultural Revolution at the time. All their elite academics had basically had no social capital. They'd been punished. They'd suffered all through the Cultural Revolution. Nobody was really listening to them. And the only team of academics and smart people that was sort of left untouched were military scientists. They had, the political capital. They had computers. They had all the equipment. So they were able to push through this process, and they thought of it like a rocket's trajectory. Okay, we need to get from point A to point B. So what's the best way to do it? Let's calculate this way. But they didn't take into account things like changes in human reproductive behavior, for example. And let's not forget, in the 60s and 70s, there was it wasn't just China that was worried about, the planet overrunning itself. It was a very popular idea at the time. There were, zero population growth came along. People published books like The Population Bomb.
Right.
There were all these crazy scenarios that said that basically by now we would all be, wiped out because of our, so it was a very popular idea at the time, but only China had basically that kind of authoritarian government that actually put these ideas into practice in the most drastic way possible.
Let's talk about how the policy was put into practice, because that's, again, so fascinating for most of us who are completely ignorant to this idea, much as how, if you implemented it, it would be enforced. It sounds like the kind of idea where if some politician presented it outside all the obvious controversies, the question would be, all right, well, how are you going to enforce that? How did they do it? Was it successful?
Well, the problem with, such an unpopular rule can obviously not be enforced without severe coercion. So one of the first things they found was, in order to make people comply, they had this nationwide accountability system for all officials. All officials in the small towns had what they call a one-vote veto rule. They had to meet these birth quotas, and if they didn't, it didn't matter how well they did their jobs elsewhere, they would basically face demotion or lose their jobs or be censured. So right away, there was this really harsh system imposed on the population police. And then, of course, in turn, the population police had to be even harsher to the population to make it happen. So there were all these cases where they would say, okay, we can't have another birth for 100 days, and they would just go out, and anybody who was going to give birth in the next 100 days would be taken away. And these all sound really extreme, but their stories really were true, especially in the countryside. And it wasn't just, we think forced sterilizations, forced abortions, that's a part of it too, but it was very intrusive beyond that too. So, let's say you say, okay, fine, I'm totally on board with not having more than one child, 2 children. I don't want more than that. But I don't want to be sterilized, especially the way they would sterilize people, would take them all into sort of a mass procedure and lots of, it just, there were some botched operations. I promised to take the pill or IUD or whatever, but they wouldn't listen. They would say, no, we can't trust you. We're going to take you off and round you up with a whole bunch of people and go do it. Sorry, whether you like it or not. So it was very intrusive right down to those kind of levels. And, and even if you were fine and compliant, let's say you had a cousin or a relative who did. And, one of the ways they would try and make this happen was by bringing the force upon your relative. Say a woman was pregnant and she wanted to give birth. So she would go into hiding. She didn't want to be taken away for a forced abortion. Well, in many cases, then the population police would come and maybe detain your mother. They'll take your mother and put her in a cell somewhere and
wow.
and send a word out and say, okay, if you don't show up for your abortion, your mom is, in jail.
Wow.
And she's going to be kept that way for a long time. And they'd even charge these people for the detention process. Every day would be like, $2 or $3 for the cost of feeding you.
That is unbelievable. How was forced sterilization done? Was it to the woman, the man?
Well, in most parts of the country, it was women, even though, but in Sichuan, which is one of the most populous areas in China, they actually developed this whole process called the no-scalpel vasectomy, which is actually done in lots of third world countries now. It's considered a very safe and quick way. The way I had it described to me by somebody who saw it was you sort of stick a crochet hook into the scrotal sac, and you sort of wriggle it about, and 2 or 3 minutes later, Bob's your uncle, you're done. And this process was so popular and so easy. They used to do it like exhibitions in town squares to show people that, look, you should do this. You should come forward. It's nice and easy. Come forward and do it.
That is potentially one of the worst things that have been said on the radio program of all time. And I mean, particularly the Bob's you're done phrase, which I think, Mei, that you inserted that yourself. I guarantee no one said that. That is unbelievable to me. All of it is really, but was this policy applied equally across the population? Did the elite, did the wealthy, the powerful, the connected, could they have as many kids as they wanted? Could they protect their own families?
Well, yeah, the policy was definitely not evenly applied. I mean, in order to make this work in a country as large as China, all sorts of exceptions were made to the rules. So you could theoretically have more than one child. You could have exceptions made if you were, if you could pay the penalties, if you could, if depending on what you worked as. If you were a fisherman or a coal miner, you can have more than one child. If you're a Tibetan or one of the member of China's minorities, you usually can have more than one child. And so there was this whole elaborate system of exceptions that is kind of like the U.S. tax code. People in China find it confusing themselves,
right.
Let alone people outside China. But one of the big processes that involved was, in the end, the people who could have more than one child and usually were not, subject to the sort of forcible issues like forced abortion were rich people. You never read in the papers of a rich woman being hauled off and having, those things happen to poor people, to peasant farmers. And what we have now is, that the issue of children becomes one of the factors in China's huge huge income inequity. There's a big gap now between the poor and the rich in China, and one of the issues that adds to it is the one-child policy.
Yeah, well, how has, now that this policy has been in place for how many years?
35 years.
How has the one-child policy shaped China, its character, its culture, and its economy, its population? I mean, we it's always interesting to look at any policy, including one as horrific as this, after it's been that's been in place for so long. We've now got 35-year-old single child, and how has it affected China's character?
In a word, it's basically created a sort of a population that is too old, it's too male, and it's too few. That's how I characterize it. So too too old. One of the problems is, China, like everywhere else, is having a big aging boom, right? We're all living longer now. So they have, I think by 2050, 1 in 4 Chinese will be a retiree. That hasn't anything to do with the policy. But the problem is that the policy means that there'll be a whole lot less younger people to take care of these old people. So you're going to have issues with pension shortfalls. You're going to have issues with, imagine you're one kid and you have like 6 adults to take care of. And let's say this one has Alzheimer's, that one has Parkinson's. All the social, emotional baggage that comes with that, that's going to be huge going ahead. And then the gender issue is a big problem, too, because right now I think China has something like 30 million more men than women because, when people could only have one child and because traditionally in Chinese culture they like boys better than girls. So you have, now, so people would say, okay, I'm going to have one child, I'm going to have a boy. So now you have 30 million more men than women. That's like the population of Canada. You got all these men who have no chance of finding brides, and you can imagine what kind of a situation this could cause in terms of criminal tendencies, social unrest. And then the last point I make is too few is, China's whole economy has driven by things like cheap labor, which comes from a large workforce. So when that workforce goes away, China has to move to the next stage now. And you still need a lot of workers to keep the economy going. That's the thing they need going forward. So they're either going to have to make sure that every worker is much more productive, or they're going to need to grow their workers, which is one of the problems. This is why they've moved to a two-child policy now. They realize they really, in order to keep that China economic growth going forward, they need more people, not less.
Yeah, that's a really interesting thing to discuss and debate as well, because it touches on the immigration issue in the U.S. as well as the refugee issue, because a lot of economists will talk about, the more people that come in, the better it is for the economy, and we can debate and discuss that anytime. But so I question the cultural idea of the preference for boys. Help me understand that. I will say I wanted a boy myself, and when I found out I was having a girl, I was disappointed. And then I had a girl, and my wife got pregnant again, and I said, I sure hope it's another girl because it's the greatest thing in the world. So that's my story. But what is that cultural thing about preferring boys?
Well, if you go back to China in the old days, boys were definitely part of, a strong cultural preference, and there was a part rooted on an agricultural basis. Farms, needed male labor, to work the farm, till the farm. And also in terms of inheritance, all the inheritance was structured to go to the male name. So, and the men are considered the ones who carry the male name. It's horrible, but it's not just China. Look at
No, it's
Austen
Italy.
And
it's Italy.
Or England. You remember, that's what Jane Austen wrote about, right? Pride and Prejudice, all this desperate need for women to get married.
I'll go ahead and say right, as if I know what Jane Austen wrote about and try to sound smart. But no, it's certainly not China alone. But it's a terrible thing, especially when the boy ends up being the creep and the girl's the hero, and he gets everything and spends it all on drugs and crime. But anyway, I'm digressing here. So let's talk about, though, that how it has affected the economy and the real effects of the economy. The fact that there aren't enough people is that there's not enough people for the economy to run efficiently or to progress in China?
It's the mix. It's the age group and the demographic. So right now what you have is, you still have a lot of people in China, but you're talking relativity. So right now you have relatively about 5 working adults to support 1 retiree. That's pretty good. That's a very good, economic percentage. But in about 20 years, that's going to change very drastically. So you're going to have about 1.6 working adults to support 1 elderly person. That's a huge jump. This is the kind of jump that Europe took 50 years to get to. China's only going to do it in 1 generation. And, it needs to prepare all this social care, Medicaid, social safety stuff, all this hospices, hospitals. And it hasn't, this is a very short time to get all this ready.
Is there anything good, positive, that could come out of this one-child policy that China had for 35 years?
Well, for women, it was good for urban women. If you were a girl and you were born in a city and you didn't have any siblings, this is very good for you. You could advance. You didn't have any brothers who will be fighting for the same resources as you were. So women, urban professional women, made great advances in the last 20 or 30 years in China. They were all able to go to college and get great jobs and better numbers. But here's the problem with the one-child policy. We seem to we seem to think that it's all or nothing, that you had to do this for this to happen, for this boon to happen. But that's not true. There are plenty of other countries around the region that also managed to reduce their population and give women advancement and grow the economy without having to resort to anything quite so drastic.
How do the Chinese, how do you speak for the entire population of any country? But the issue of abortion in America, obviously, I don't need to explain that to you. How do they look at the procedure? There's about, almost half of Americans consider it murder. Do Chinese, some Chinese, do they look at it that way?
I think the percentages are relatively fewer. You must remember, China is, the belief system is relatively mix of Confucianism, Taoism, all that. Not a huge percentage of Catholics or Christians in the way that it is here. So there were not a lot of cultural roots, strong aversion to the idea of abortion that China needed to root out in a way you would have in, say, South America, for example, which is very Catholic. So there wasn't that, and there was this strong sense of practicality that, if you live in China, it's really crowded. It's very, so the sense of we need to do something was very strong, and the support for the idea of reducing the population was also very strong. And the sad part of it all is that, the Chinese government could have mobilized this social goodwill to a much better degree and gotten a huge reduction in population without having to go to such extremes.
What is it like? I mean, there's just got to be millions and millions of single only childs. We've got all kinds of stereotypes and judgments we make of only children, and there's plenty of studies. I don't know how conclusive they are, but it must be an interesting sociological experiment to accidentally have, it's not the kind of study that you would be able to morally create, but since it happened, I'm sure a lot of demographers, sociologists, psychologists have studied it. What does it mean that there's so many 35-year-old single, only children?
Okay, that's about 65% of the population is one-child families.
Wow.
So that's very significant, right? And of course, within social studies, there's always a very squishy kind of a thing but we do agree. Yep. We know their characteristics. Baby boomer characteristic is very different from a millennial generation, for example. So within the Little Emperor cohort, a lot of studies have been done, many of them very inconclusive, but there was one that I found very interesting because it stood apart because it measured different cohorts rather than measuring children with siblings versus children with no siblings. And this was a study done about 2 or 3 years ago by Australian economists. They did a whole series of play games where they tested the children in terms of, not children per se, but the generations in terms of what they wanted to do, whether they were more generous. And the conclusion was the Little Emperor generation, children born in the 80s, tend to be less optimistic. They're more risk-averse. They're not as generous. And so this has, interesting implications going ahead. Are they going to be, not so entrepreneurial? That's a big question mark because we are so used to think of China as this dynamic economic place, and if the Little Emperor generation isn't as entrepreneurial, then you're not going to start new big companies. If you realize that you have to take care of 6 adults, maybe you're not going to do a startup. Maybe you're going to take a nice, safe job in a government.
Right, right. Yeah, and I read one story about this, about how, one child was raised and his parents bought him a computer, and then he ends up wanting to do video game design, and his parents are like, "You're crazy. That would be like going into porn for an American parent." And yet the kid's now, been very successful with that. But the idea that he took a risk is foreign. You want to take that secure job. I mean, it's just. It's crazy what happens as a result of this. But let me ask you about how this policy got lifted, and what was the reaction in China when the government said we're lifting the one-child policy? I mean, in America, it was headline news for a day, but I, been fascinated by it since I heard about it. How did people react in China?
Well, just to get backtrack, it's not been entirely listed. They say 2 children right now, but that's still a limit. That's still a restriction. So let's say you want 3 or 4, you're not going to be able to have it. Let's say you want the second one, but maybe you want to have it in a time of your own choosing rather than a prearranged government time. Well, you might have to have an abortion or pay a fine. So there's still restrictions going on, even if they've moved to a 2-child policy. I think in general, the idea in China is still that, well, yes, thank God it's been lifted. Here's one more, thing thing that we don't have to worry about, that's great. But that said, there's so plenty of Chinese people, especially in cities, that said, heck, 2-child, I'm not going to do it. It's too expensive. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to have a second child just because the government's trying to encourage me, not unless they make living in a city much easier and cheaper. I mean, I have one child and I worry about how I'm going to raise her. It's so expensive, and there's pollution and food safety issues.
Yeah.
So I guess the big success, if you might call it, of the one-child policy is it's really made the mindset of Chinese people very focused on the idea that the one-child family is the most successful best way forward.
Really, such a fascinating issue, and you're such a great journalist. I'm looking forward to reading your book. It's called One Child, the story of China's most radical experiment, and they've taken some pretty radical experiments. It's fair to say. It's now available on ebook, and it'll come out in hardcover in January. I'm going to steal the question from our listener, Deep Breath Steve, and ask you as we wrap up here: how does the one-child policy affect relationships, affect marriages, and dating? Are there, that's good. Yeah, it probably comes up. A lot of interesting dating websites names that I could riff on, but I mean, what does that mean for dating? Because there's a lot more boys than there are girls, right?
Yeah, let's imagine you're a man in China right now, and you're 30-something, right? And you are probably the only child if you live in the city, and you're very aware that there may not be so many women. So your parents would probably have immense pressure on you to say, well, you got to get married because you got to get me that grandchild. But you, at the same time, you know that there's a marriage squeeze. So most likely your parents would have hawked a big amount of money to get you an apartment because they know that there's a marriage squeeze. They want to make you more attractive in the marriage market.
Oh, my gosh.
So, you've got mortgage slaves there, so, it's like the subprime mortgage. I met this guy who was they have this term in China to describe it. It's called fangnu. It means house slave. It means somebody who's basically hawked the farm to go and pay a very expensive mortgage. I met this young man who is exactly that. His parents had spent all this money, and he spends 80% of his income every month servicing the mortgage. So he has no money to date, and that's the whole point of getting the apartment, to get the dates. But he's got no money now because all his money's going to date. So he's in this kind of a circle, this big problem.
I just think the one thing that rises to me is there's such a dependence, a codependency between children and their parents, and parents and their children in this culture, in America as well. But the idea that I'm going to owe my mom and dad everything, including the reason I met my wife, and that I've then got to obviously take care of them in their adult lives, and that is a very, I think, probably somewhat foreign concept to certainly Americans and other Westerners. This idea that you're being set up to succeed relationship wise in every possible way. Your parents are selling everything that you can have a little bit bigger apartment so that you can attract a woman. That's wild.
Exactly. Well, I met this couple, and they, husband and wife, and they wanted to sell their apartment and buy an RV and go around the world. Now, that sounds perfectly fun, to do, right? Very reasonable idea. But when they did this, and they're Chinese, and they got so much criticism between the Chinese internet because they said, how can you be such a bad son as to sell your apartment and selfishly go around the world and have adventures?
My God. Wow. I want to talk to you about the story you won the Pulitzer Prize for. We'll do that another time. You're a great reporter, journalist, and writer, and we're really happy to have you joining our conversation, Mei Fong. Thank you. Thank you very much. Absolutely. What a great guest. Good job getting her, guys. Mei Fong, writer, by the way, on Twitter, MEIFONG writer, meifong.com.